Right. I've probably forgotten half of what I learned 2 years ago, you know. So, you can't hardly see anything on this map, but just, this is Germany, this whole area. A lot of what took place during Martin Luther's time was right in this general area. Eisleben, Erfurt, things like that you'll hear me talking about. We started our trip, we landed in Frankfurt, and then we just kind of made a trip around Germany. Martin Luther was born on November 10th, 1483. His father was a miner. His name was Hans Luther. His wife, Marguerite, in Eisleben. His father was quite successful in the mining and smelting business, so that when it came time to send Luther to school and so on and so forth, he had the means to do it. So he wasn't born into a poor family by any means. Home discipline was very severe. Luther was often beaten for minor infractions. This made him an industrious and disciplined worker all of his life. Hans sent Luther to his first school at the age of 4.5. Stayed at that school for 9.5 years, and discipline was severe there also. Students were not taught to think, but to memorize. Classes were in Latin, not in German, so they couldn't even use their own native language. And in order to advance through the various schools and so on, all of the teaching was in Latin, so being fluent in Latin was essential for the path that he was taking. So due to his good records, his father sent him to Erfurt University in 1501, and in May of 1505 he began to study law so he would have a good profession. I think I will go through a couple of pictures here before I keep going with this. So we took off from Minneapolis. We landed in Frankfurt, and we proceeded to Mainz, which is on the Rhine River. The significance of Mainz is that this is where Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press. And just the times were right in the world that these things could kind of come together. So the fact that that printing press was available also came in handy later on when it came to printing the Bible and getting these out into multiple copies instead of just one copy at a time. And another view of the same place. Street view of Mainz. And these pictures are going to kind of bounce around time-wise, so it isn't going to go nice and neat one after the other here. Johann Sebastian Bach was another famous person at that time, and he was in Eisenach, and so we also then had a chance to visit for the Bach house. I didn't go in and visit this one, but Judy did, and she said it was pretty impressive.
Very awesome.
Awesome, she said. Okay, then, one of the first trips that we made was to Wartburg Castle, and this is where Luther translated the Bible into German. Prior to that, the church really didn't just give out the Bible, or they just kind of kept a lot of it to themselves and just preached on what little bits that they wanted to preach on. So we went trucking up this hill. And some more. Good healthy climb. And that's a view from up at the top of the castle. And this trip was in November, so it's some leaves fall and kind of in that in-between time. Now we're jumping back down to a place called, and I can't really go up here and point, here's Eisenach and here's Erfurt and all of this. I don't think you'd really learn any more by my saying you're going here, here, here. So this is where he did a lot of his work in Eisenach, kind of called a his workhouse. This is a model of the city of Burford, of the old city. I'll show you a picture in a minute. But there's a stream that you can see going through here. There's a really neat bridge right here. And that is our tour guide. Her name was Ingeborg. We called her Inga. And she was explaining that model. She's standing right in front of that model of that church. So briefly, there were 5 of us from this area that went on this trip. Pastor Tim, Kenny Harbaugh, myself, Judy, and her friend Joy Barch. We met up with 2 other groups. One was from Arizona, and the other one was from upstate New York. And so there were about 30 of us on the tour. We stopped when we were in Erfurt Blue. It was showing us some stuff about indigo dye was made. Of course, in those days, indigo was a very prized, precious cloth, anything that was dyed in indigo. So we were shown a little bit about how that indigo was made. That branch that's sticking up there is, what's it called? Indigofera, the name of the plant that the dye is extracted from. And it has to be extracted in an alkaline basic solution. And so that's how you get the dye out. The process is long. I sat and read it, and yeah, sure. A lot of detail. And I can't read that any better than anybody else in here, probably. But it was just more of a little bit of a close-up of that piece of fabric that was dyed with this indigo dye. Okay, where I showed you that bridge that went across that little stream, there's a little creek that just comes underneath. And it's a long, huge bridge. It shops on either side. There are 3 stories of shops. Some of the shop owners lived there, but their shops were down in this, narrow bridge that went all the way underneath there. Really a neat place. And I guess I did have to make proof that I did go on the trip, so. And then this lady that kind of likes flowers, she happened to be there too, so. Her picture's in here too. Just showing some of the time he was in some of these cities. He did at one point make a journey to Rome. They were trying to get Rome to make some reforms in the way the Catholic Church was being run. And when he was there, he was witnessing what he thought was really some pretty, well, he wasn't happy with what he saw. In other words, the priests would just zip through the sermons, and they just didn't seem to be showing any reverence for what they really were supposed to be doing there. This is one of the things that bothered him. This is one little room we were by. It's kind of a little desk, I suppose, that he used. That rose is placed there. Was it replaced every day or what? I suppose it had to be if it was a real rose. Anyway, in his memory, this, well, okay, so this is the sparse area where the monks were served their meals. I suppose I'd give you a little update on what made him decide to become a monk in the first place. Let's see. I think it was in 1505 or thereabouts that he just finished a session in school. He decided to take a vacation to see his parents, and on the way back to Erfurt, this is where this event took place that changed the rest of his life. He was caught in a severe thunderstorm, and a powerful lightning stroke hit close enough to him that it knocked him to the ground. He is said to have called out, "Help, St. Anne, and I will become a monk." So that's really what got him to decide to become a monk. And also at this time, he was kind of struggling with himself. He thought, well, he's just kind of getting degrees and teaching and preaching, or I wasn't preaching at that time, but teaching and so on, that he really wasn't thinking of heavenly things. It was more earthly stuff. And so that was bothering him also at the same time. And so in 1505, then, he knocked on the door of what's called the Black Monastery and asked for admittance to the monastery to become a monk. His father wasn't very happy because he wanted him to become a lawyer or do something worthwhile, so to speak. So he stayed there then for quite some time, got various degrees. By 1515, he was appointed district vicar over 10 monasteries, so he was kind of working his way up in this sort of areas also. Oh, let's see what's coming up here. This is just, Eisleben is the town in which he was born, baptized, and died. And it was a mining town at one time. This is what his father was involved in. It was in mining. So there was a couple of little cars there showing the little cars that they were transporting ore in. And you'll see several pictures like this. But these cathedrals are huge and decorated, and the pipe organs are something else. Just this is an indulgence box. And this is one of the things that the Catholic Church has been doing for centuries, was gathering indulgences, little bits of money here and there. The money would go to the Pope, and that's how all these fancy cathedrals and castles and things like this that got built. But this is one of the things that really bothered Luther, was that he just didn't really think that was right, because by donating to these boxes, then you were forgiven of your sins and you wouldn't end up spending the rest of your life in purgatory. That's what I have here. It just says, whoever willingly sacrificed his hard-earned money was remitted of his sins and would not have to burn in purgatory after death. And then there happened to be a particularly person that was good at doing this. He was a dealer in indulgences, and he was a Dominican monk. And people would just travel from quite some distance to put their, if they only had a few coins, but they'd give one of them to him, and they'd get this piece of paper. My sins are forgiven, I'm all good to go. And that was, like I say, this is just all leading up to what he is, getting up to here. So Luther said his understanding of Scripture told him that the only condition for forgiveness of sins was unshakable faith in God. Thus, the professor and doctor of theology formulated the 95 Theses, and so that's what he posted on the wall, and that's part of what we went there to see, was these 95 Theses and all the aftermath of that. Okay. Side trip a little bit here. This is Martin's wife. Sometime just a little bit prior to this, he shed his monk's clothing and was just like a regular citizen. And his wife, Katerina, she had also been in the convent but wanted out, and so her and I think 7 other sisters in this convent where they managed to get themselves smuggled out, and they ended up falling in love and getting married. And she's about 15 years younger than he is. And she bore him 6 children in the first 9 years of their marriage. What's coming up here next? All right, there's an interesting story on this one. That little stream there looks pretty clean. It goes through, I'm not sure what town it's going through. But anyway, sanitation wasn't a really big thing in those days. And so it was used as more or less of a common sewer. And there was a brewery not far from here. And so the brewery would put out the notice that telling the guys, don't pee in here because we're going to take that water tomorrow and make beer. So that was the source of the water for making beer. So just go somewhere else. And that's the Castle Church. So what were we saying earlier? I'm forgetting some of the stuff I've been even reading here, but this is one of the more significant churches that we viewed. And when our tour group was in this town, several of the folks went to church there. And this is the Castle Church. After Martin, well, this Melanchthon was a co-worker of Martin Luther's. And after Martin Luther's death in Eisleben, he was taken to Wittenberg, and that's where he is buried. And also this Philip Melanchthon, who was a co-worker of his, is also in that church. So that's these 2 monuments or plaques to those 2 people are in this Castle Church. And when he posted these theses, and most of it was against the indulgences, that was his one biggest thing, and 94 other things are on here. It was all things that he felt that the Catholic Church needed to make some changes. He wasn't really out to start a new branch of Christianity so much as to get the Catholic Church to make some reforms, one of which is these indulgences, but there were several other things also that were, of importance to him to try to get discussed. And the original was just, a piece of paper and all that stuff written on it. And now it's been put on these bronze plaques on this door. And there's a statue of Martin Luther, monument. And they finally did supply fresh water, so they didn't have to keep using that sewer forever. That's a fountain that they pointed out to us. This was in one of these buildings we were at. We spent a lot of time staring at this. It's depicting the 10 Commandments. And I suppose you can look around here and say, okay, now this one is referring to, one thing or the other of the commandments, but perhaps the one in the lower right might be depicted that you should not commit adultery. And a number of other ones that we kind of picked up, but we thought were most of them, but it's not that easy to do. There was an artist by the name of Kranich. He made a lot of sketches. This is his wife, Katharina. He also had made sketches of Martin Luther at various times, so there are a lot of pictures available from that time period that were done by this particular sketch artist. This is the apartment where Martin and his Katharina lived. It was rather interesting to see that, all that flooring and the table and all of these things. And on the left is where we're walking past it. But that's where they lived, and that still survived, from 500 years ago. Still there. This is another one of the painting by Kranich. near the end of his life, he gained a lot of weight, and he was very ill during his later years. He had a number of debates with different people about whether what he was saying was correct or not, and the Catholic Church was really out to get him, basically. They stripped him, he was excommunicated. At that point, he was considered to be a common outlaw, so he really could have been shot or whatever. So he was more or less ambushed by friends of his, and they took him to Wartburg Castle. So that's that one we saw just about at the very beginning of the slides here, and that's where time that he spent there, and everybody else thought, well, maybe he's been killed and he's out of the picture. But that's where he translated the Latin Bible into German, and his intent was so that all of the common people could read the Bible for themselves and make up their own mind how things were, not just being told what the church thought they should hear. And then at a later time, he also then translated the Old Testament, so that eventually the entire Bible had been translated into German. And then copies, got spread out. And this Kranich also did a lot of sketching in some of these Bibles, so even though even people that were illiterate could understand the basic concepts of what's in the Bible. So this was done quite some time after this, posting of these theses. It was between 1530 and 1534 that he completed the translation of the Old Testament. And so by that time, then the complete Bible was available in German. We'll just skip ahead to some generalized pictures here, I think, for a while. Then we did make a trip into Berlin, and this had nothing to do with Luther's work, but it was just part of the tour that we were on, so we went to some other very interesting places also. This is the Brandenburg Gate. This is what divided East and West Berlin. And on that particular day, things got a little tense because it also happened to have been the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. And so they were parading around this square in front of the Brandenburg Gate also. And it made all of us feel just a little, I don't know if I want to be here. Nothing happened, but there was a significant police presence. So they were allowed to do their thing. This is a Jewish memorial. It's in Berlin, and it's just these stones, and you kind of have to get your own impression. At some places you're walking along, all these little blocks are fairly low. At other places you can walk up and down little hills. So what does all this mean? Now you see me, now you don't? I mean, it's just, it's part of the Holocaust memorial. And just some neat landscaping. This is in Dresden. Most of what we've been talking about has been in this general area here. Then we went up to Berlin. Then we traveled down to Dresden. Later on, we went down to Augsburg, and this is where the Augsburg Confessions were written. And then our last stop, we went through Augsburg and then to Munich, and so that's where we ended our trip. So these depictions of, these are all the kings in Germany from like the 1200s all the way up to as long as they had kings in Germany. done in Meissen Portland, or porcelain. How many of you have heard of Meissen porcelain? I don't see any hands going up. It's very fancy glasswork. The dishes and pottery, on a previous trip over to Germany, we got to go in to see some of this porcelain being made. Very intricate, it's very expensive stuff. And anyway, this whole area here is made up of little tiles, individual tiles of this porcelain. That's what was, it goes for, could be a couple hundred feet. More than that, 300-400 feet, one end to the other. So how many tiles are in there? This is a church in Dresden called Church of the Lady, or Frauenkirche. The dark portion is all that remained after the bombing in 1945, right near the end of the war. And so in Germany, they don't just tear things down and build a new house. They restore the older things that have been destroyed. So during the Russian occupation, because Dresden is in East Germany, all this rubble was just laying there, and people, you know, the residents of the town, of the city, guarded that rubble for several years after the war, actually until 1989 when the wall fell. And then they started putting it back together, and they from sketches and other photos and things that were available, they were able to rebuild this church. So I'm saying the dark was about the only part that was left standing after the bombing in 1945. And that's inside the restored church. Just these, I mean, they're just, you can't believe how huge and how ornate so much of this stuff is. This is jumping way heck down into Munich, but we saw these lumps up in the trees and said, what the dickens is that? It's mistletoe. Mistletoe is a parasitic plant that attaches itself to trees and eventually kills the trees, so that's just kind of neat. Here's the 13th century church. This is where Bach was the cantor and he was the choir director in this church. And a statue of Johann Sebastian Bach. Okay, so this town is also where, just backing up in time again now, where Martin Luther debated Johann Eck. And he was an opponent of what Martin Luther was trying to teach. And this is where Martin denied the divine origin of papal supremacy. So what does that mean? It's kind of just saying that the Pope really isn't the supreme head of this whole organization. Do you have any better explanation than I do? This is called the Church of Our Lady, but there's an ornate clock. And I think I missed the main part, but there were some animated portions. Others had better pictures of it. The man standing facing you here is not a statue. He's a mime. And they will stand absolutely still. And there's usually a little box in front of them, and people throw a few coins in. And whenever he seems to think there's enough money in there, then he will put on a little show, a little mime depicting one thing or another. And then he stops and he's just absolutely still again. Statue on the larger statue behind is a bronze statue depicting the horrors of war. This is a couple of poor pictures. Hitler was bound and determined that he was going to have the biggest and the best and the grandest, and anything he built was going to even be better than the Colosseum and Greek things. And so he was in the process of getting this built, but of course it never got finished, so it's pretty much just abandoned at this point. So we basically just drove through it, and I think they kind of wanted us to see that this is one of the plans that Hitler had that never came to fruition. It's not just used for data storage. And another fantastic pipe organ. There were many, many, many pipe organs. They were just unbelievable. That was part of the reason, not the only reason I wanted this trip by any means, but this young lady sitting next to me here is Manya. That's the exchange student that lived at Laurie's house for a year and went to school in Seneca. And so we were able to get a hold of enough people to get it so she could come and visit for a little bit. And there's Pastor Tim, Kenny Harbaugh. I don't know if the pictures aren't as clear to you as they are from what I'm looking at, but anyway. That's the last night I think we were in Munich having supper. We also did tour the BMW plant and some pretty fancy cars. And this is Tim's next car. He thought that car was pretty cute. So. This is the Theatiner Church. It's in Munich, and much of Munich was also destroyed during the war. But so much of this has been reconstructed, and that work is still going on. This was a little street scene. They were getting ready for Christmas, and all these little characters, they're all animated, so they're doing this and that, and moving up and down, and sawing wood, and it was just cute and all get out. Little monkey was probably reaching his hand down to do something, and so on and so forth. This is in Munich. It's a water control pond. Apparently Munich is very flat, so they have to take quite a bit of effort to make sure the place doesn't get flooded. It's just the Hall of the Generals in Munich. And just a neat place. Colors are so pretty as we drove into this motel, Marriott Hotel, where we stayed in Munich. Breakfast and suppers were almost always included when we got to the end of the day, whatever hotel we were staying in for the night. So meals were excellent. Usually during the midday we were kind of on our own to find a bite to eat. So, and I don't have any pictures out here, but they're fruit markets and like farmers market type things. They're just unbelievable. And they're beautiful. They're just all kinds of good, lots of goodies, lots of sausage places. You find pizza places over here, over there you find sausage. Oh, it was Germany and sausage, right? And that's another water control measure. And then we came home. We managed to make a half hour out of it. One little tail end bit here now and then. So by the time most of this translation and so on had taken place, Luther was 52 years old, and it was remarkable for that time. His body was showing times of, rigors of time. Illnesses were plaguing him. He was suffering from kidney stones. And he said if he was going to die, he wanted to be with company and friends. So he set out by carriage on the bumpy road to Wittenberg. Well, the stone dislodged. And he wrote to his wife, he says, I've been feel reborn. Felt much better. Anyway, illnesses continued to plague him. And by the end of 1545, he had to discontinue teaching. He returned to Eisleben, the town where he was born, and he died there on February 18th, 1546. And a couple of those pictures that I showed you there, his body was taken to Wittenberg and buried in the Catholic Church. His wife lived some years later. She died in 1552. And she was 15 years his junior when they were married. Any questions, which I probably can't answer, but that's kind of what we had. It was a very enjoyable trip.
The motels were first class. I think they were
Yep, yep.
really nice.
Yeah. Excellent accommodations, excellent tour guide. Sometimes we were kind of handed, not exactly handed off, but would split the group into maybe two parts, and a couple of other people then would take some of us and go and look at this area and some other different areas. But all in all, I think they did a wonderful job of putting on the tour. The tour guide was very helpful, very informative. And her and Judy got to be good friends.
She cried the day we left.
So I think she enjoyed us too, our tour guide.
Jean, in any of the churches there, inside, do they have, like different stations where, when Danny and I were there, again, churches were just gorgeous and the pipe organs were amazing, but the couple of churches we went, they had actually stations where skeletons were laying there, was like their past priests or saints, and they had their jewels and all kinds of things hanging over, but it was just their skeleton in a glass case, and they had one of the churches had like maybe 8 different areas like that in their church. Did you see?
Yeah, we saw some of them.
Did you see some of that?
Yeah.
Okay. I just thought that was pretty strange. And just like diamonds and rubies and gold and stuff were hanging on these skeletons.
Yeah, yeah. We're,
And there was an area where a lady was painting.
yeah, there were some figures that just needed repair, repainting, and so there was a lady in there repainting a lot of these figures that were in the various, well, in this particular church that she was working in. Also, another area I kind of remember is that there were like little sections in this church, and it looked like there had been a funeral, so some of the flowers were still in front, and they were kind of getting ready for another one here and another one there. So there were several little chambers that with flowers and all sorts of things in preparation for a funeral.
And wonderful bakeries.
Oh, yes. And I mean, the breakfast, I mean, it wasn't just a donut, cup of coffee.
It was a smorgasbord.
It was a smorgasbord. I mean, it was just, if you went home hungry, it was your own fault. So that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much.